All right, all right. Thank you for joining me on another episode of The Gospel Truth. I'm your host, Marla Wilson, and we have another exciting show for you guys today. Man, always some good shows, man. I have a whole bunch of shows coming up, and this one is one of the more exciting ones that I was looking forward to, man. This is one of the first for The Gospel Truth. We have a theistic evolutionist versus a young earth creationist, and this is going to be a pretty interesting one. But before we bring these guys in, I do want to go ahead and encourage you to go ahead and like and follow The Gospel Truth. Make sure you subscribe, like, do the whole nine, do what you have to do. Also, go over to the YouTube and Facebook page and do that. And when you're there, go ahead and hit the notification bell so you'll be notified whenever I upload new content and whenever I go live. Also, this content is on podcast, so be sure to flow over to iTunes, Stitcher, Spotify, Google Play, all those major platforms to subscribe and listen to the audio version of these debates. And let me go ahead and go over a couple of announcements of shows that I have coming up. All right, coming up April 6th, I have James E. Martin, Reformed Christian, versus Warren McGrew, who is representing a pre-Augustinian position. And they'll be debating, is total depravity biblical? That's coming up April 6th, 2020 at 6 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. After that, I have Sam Shimon. He's going to be debating or having a discussion with Kwaku El, who's a Mormon. And they're going to be talking about Joseph Smith. Is he a prophet? Was he a prophet? That's coming up April 9th, 2020, 6 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. And coming up April 14th, 2020, I have Jordan Gramrat, atheist, and Shane Helton, Christian. They'll be discussing is God's existence coherent and congruent with reality. That's coming up April 14th, 2020. And then, then finally I have Daniel Allgood and Cole Perkins, and they'll be debating sensationism or continuationist. Does the Bible teach sensationism? That's coming up at April 17, 2020 at 6 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. Once again, that is just the next 4 shows that are coming up. So be on the lookout for all these upcoming shows, and also plan on doing some Bible lessons. I haven't done one in quite some time, so I do want to go ahead and jump into that again. So we'll see what I desire to do, what God put on my heart to do. So I'm excited for what's going on with the Gospel Truth, as you should too. And I hope that you are looking for ways to support the ministry. If you feel in your heart to support the ministry financially, that's cool. I do have my links in the description area of these videos on YouTube. So if you feel in your heart that God is calling you or pushing you to give or donate something to this ministry, I appreciate that. And if not anything, I do appreciate your time and just coming through and checking out the page and everything. But make sure you subscribe before you leave the page. Like I said, we have a theistic evolutionist creation, young earth creation debate coming on, and Mr. Seth Bloomsburg versus Robert Rowe. Robert Rowe is known, I think he's with Centennial Apologetics. He has a YouTube page, and I think he has about 35,000 followers, so he's out there doing his thing. And Mr. Seth Bloomsburg, y'all know Seth, man, he just came on about a week ago, 2 weeks ago. He filled in for a debate, and he came on prior to that and debated the atheists. So Seth is a familiar face around these parts. So I do appreciate both of these guys coming in. But let me bring these guys in so they could introduce themselves. What's up, fellas? What's going on with y'all?
Hello.
How's it going?
Hello.
All right. Mr. Robert Rowe is Australia, correct? Australia?
Yes, yeah.
Whew, early morning over there, brother. Early morning. I appreciate you being way from Australia, coming on the Gospel Truth with us, man.
Thank you, and I thoroughly enjoy your shows. Like, I actually learned quite a bit with all your guests in the past debates and all that, so you do a good job.
Thanks, man. Appreciate that. What's up, Seth, man? Jumping on here
Hello.
again, man.
Can't get enough.
You can't get enough, man. Can't get enough of that debate, Gospel Truth dialoguing. So that's good stuff, good stuff. So I'm going to give you guys time to go ahead and introduce yourself to the audience if they don't know you. Robert, if you don't mind, go ahead and give a quick introduction to yourself.
Well, I've been a Christian for 10 years, and basically I've grown in the faith in a more academic sort of context. So I'm currently doing an engineering degree, and I started Sentinel 2017-ish, 2018-ish. I've started writing studies for a local church, and so far I've finished Ephesians, currently going through Revelation. We've got 2 more studies left to go. We just finished chapter 18. and yeah, I come from a science context. I come from an evolutionary, background context, and I was quite surprised to see that if I look at the biblical text um, in light of, if I look at it from an ancient Near Eastern context, and like I don't see it contradicting. That's why I'm happy to label myself a theistic evolutionist.
All right, all right. Thank you, Rob. Appreciate you once again. All right, Seth, go ahead and give a quick introduction to yourself.
Hello, I'm Seth. I've been a Christian for basically my whole life. I come from the young earth creationist perspective, and I got interested in apologetics and debating things, debating various topics. Started seriously studying theology probably about 10 years ago because I grew up in a context where argument and debate wasn't about, even about the Bible, wasn't really encouraged. And I just, as I grew older and I realized that it's actually very biblical. You have biblical examples, not only of Paul engaging with unbelievers, but also sometimes Christians engaging with each other. For example, I think it's in Acts 18 when Apollos is corrected by Priscilla and Aquila. Both before and after, it says that he was uh, preaching accurately the things concerning Jesus. It's just after he was corrected, he did it better. So intramural debates are something that interest me, and I think they're a good use of Christians' time.
All right, all right. Thank you both fellas for coming. Thank you both fellas for coming on. Appreciate you. All right, so we're gonna go ahead and get to this debate. Once again, the topic of this debate is theistic evolution or younger creation is more biblically consistent. So with that, the format of this debate is 10-minute open statements. We're gonna go with a 60-minute cross-examination portion. Both parties get 3 10-minute opportunities to ask questions, and then we'll go to 10-minute closing, and then we'll go to Q&A from the audience. Does that sound good?
Sounds good.
All right, Robert. So you are going to go first for your 10-minute open statement, and you got it, brother.
Okay, so this type of discussion, I think, should be tackled as what I would like to consider like a gracious dialogue. There is a lot of heat and fire and smoke between the camps. So young Earth creationism, old Earth, theistic evolution. And so I don't know how Seth perceives theistic evolutionists, if they're Christian or not. Like I would consider a young Earth creationist saved and a Christian. But at the same time, I would consider their perspective to be quite recent and also anachronistic and quite possibly deceptive. So, for example, if I look at Ken Ham and I look at what he does with the Creation Museum, and I look at also the Ark Encounter and all of that stuff, I can't help but notice that there's a lot of deception going on in there, and I'm still wrestling with wondering if he and his team are aware of that deception. Like, so there's a deliberate deception, or is there an ignorant deception? And one of my friends, Ben Stanhope, he has a YouTube channel where his most recent video is called the Sins of the Creation Museum, in regards to, for example, dinosaurs existing with humans, and how a lot of the argumentation is either sensationalist sort of material that has no peer review backing, or they just were completely ignorant of the claim. So basically, it's like hearsay. They had the certain claims being made, and then, oh yeah, we'll use that as an argumentation, and then they teach their audience all that. So, and when I say anachronistic, I'm getting at the fact that, so for example, Ronald Numbers, a science historian, he points out that coming from a Seventh-day Adventist background, and he comes from a Seventh-day Adventist background. He wrote a book called The Creationists. Very clearly, he outlines how Ellen G. White's visions, she had these visions known as flood geology. So her ideas is the foundation for modern young Earth creationism. But before Ellen G. White, say in the 1600s, 1700s, or even during the Renaissance era, you have the emergence of a scientific version of uniformitarianism, which, if you go back even further back, like if you go back into the Jewish, rabbinic literature, and if you go back into the early church, and even way back into Second Temple Judaism, like analysis of, say, books like the Solomon's Ecclesiastes, there was this concept of uniformitarianism, as a basis for understanding reality. And the one time where that was sort of considered as wrong, I guess, I don't know what word to use, but was basically Ellen G. White and her flood geology. And then George Price, I think his name is, he takes her ideas in the early 1900s, and then you get Henry Morris in the 1950s, and John Whitcomb alongside with him, and then they go along with that and introduce this thing known as catastrophism, and hence that is the basis for neglecting and rejecting this long process of evolution, of not just the universe, but the earth, life, and all that. So that's sort of like a very brief intro on my understandings and research on young Earth creationism. And I don't know how many minutes I have left, but in the last few minutes, what I can say is that the early church actually gave hints as to the relationship of all life, and ultimately the basis for our salvation, like the gospel, like 1 Corinthians 15 starts with the kerygma, the notion of the Messiah dying, buried, and rising according to the scriptures. But then that's like a creedal statement where the mechanics of that is then explained by Paul later in the chapter, because he goes into this thing known as theosis in the early church, this deification, this glorification of humans, and on top of that he speaks about death as being personified and being crushed and destroyed, and he gets into this notion of decay as being solved due to the resurrection of Jesus. And so the early church had this notion that all life is connected, and for the Logos to be hypostatically joined with the creation, that's the only way that glorification can happen. And therefore, if the creation involves humans, then doesn't the creation also involve many other things, both life and non-life? And also in the early church, you had this concept of the principle of plenitude, which is like the possibility of other worlds, like ET life. So in the act, when the Logos incarnates, is he able to conform himself, or have, and at the same time have the universe conform itself in that hypostatic union, so that he's able to translate it. And sure enough, the sophisticated theology is right in line with our understandings of the fact that we're stardust. And so if Jesus' body is stardust, then basically Jesus' body is the universe, but not just the universe, but according to evolution, his body would be a hominid species of 3.8 billion years of evolution. And therefore, when Paul in Colossians 1 and Romans 8, when he talks about how he's able to reconcile heaven and earth in his body. He's created things visible, invisible, whether it's this and that, like that whole list, and he's able to, in Romans 8, pretty much be the first fruit for the corrupting bondage of the universe, and it's wrapped up in that resurrection. Then now it becomes a remarkable apologetic for the resurrection, and the theology of that, to, say, the skeptical audience who might be an evolutionist. So later on in the discussion, I can go into more details on, like, the creation account, like what early church fathers were thinking of Genesis 1. I can even tackle the ancient Near Eastern context. And I'm also what you call a concordist. So a young earth creationist is a concordist, but they hold to a young earth science, which I believe is pseudoscience, but it's still a form of concordism. They try and see this particular science in the Genesis narrative, that as if Moses believed that. So my form of concordism is obviously evolution and old earth, but Moses did not believe that. He was more of an ancient Near Eastern cosmologist. But just like, and to use this as an analogy, just like you have the prophecies of Jesus emerge like in the New Testament era, in the Second Temple era, like a new interpretation of certain passages. That's what I'm noticing with the scriptures, like with respect to creation. So for example, Isaiah 53 is not about Jesus, it's about Zerubbabel. But then it has that dual fulfillment. It has that emerging effect of, but notice the patterns of what you see in Isaiah 53 about the servant of Yahweh, and he's a suffering servant. Like, that is more fully applicable to Jesus. And so the creation narrative, I find it curious that there's certain statements made that, so basically the creation narrative is fine-tuned to communicate to an ancient audience, but is so brilliantly laid out that it can be read with a 21st century lens. And the last 2,000 years of history of commentaries on Genesis, like they ask questions like birds coming from the oceans, like this is Genesis 1:20. Like even Calvin in his commentary asked the same question, like how are birds and fish related? And sure enough, in the 1800s, when Darwin comes on the scene, you have Christians going, oh yeah, like now you can see the cladistic relationship between birds and fish. So I think that's all I need to say now. I don't know how long that was, but yeah.
All right. Thank you, Rob. Appreciate you for the opening statement. All right, Seth, you have it for 10 minutes.
The question before us tonight is whether young earth creationism or old earth creationism is biblically consistent. I'm taking the young earth creationist viewpoint. Young earth creationism is typically defined as the belief that the earth is approximately 6,000 to 10,000 years old. The primary evidence for this viewpoint comes from the book of Genesis. But as any responsible exegete knows, it's necessary to establish the literary genre of a text before interpreting it. Jesus himself teaches the necessity of this when he would preface some of his statements by saying, Scripture says, or it is written, as opposed to speaking in parables when he would say, the kingdom is like leaven, or a man who sowed seeds. The Apostle Peter warns us that stories about Jesus were not cleverly devised fables, 2 Peter 1:16. We also need to know that the Bible uses figures of speech to make statements. At different points, Isaiah refers to the four corners of the earth in Isaiah chapter 11, verse 12, but also refers to the earth as a circle in Isaiah 40, verse 22. And yet, Jesus insists that Scripture cannot be broken in John 10:35. The earth is obviously not literally a circle, nor does it literally have four corners, but both statements from Scripture are infallible in what they actually assert. So what genre is Genesis? It's quite clear that Genesis is supposed to be taken as actual, literal history. The genealogical structure of Genesis shows that Moses was not dealing with myths or imaginary persons, but real historical flesh and blood people. Throughout the genealogies, you have, Adam, he had a son, his name was Seth. and they, who had also had a son. He's clearly talking about literal historical people. The style of Genesis indicates it is very much prose, not poetry. Hebrew poetry has a characteristic style with three elements: parallelism, terseness, and ellipsis. Parallelism presents two lines of thought that correspond. Terseness presents a poetic statement by means of a noticeable economy of words. And ellipsis involves the omission of a word where it would normally be expected. All three of these characteristics of Hebrew poetry are absent from Genesis 1. One other significant feature of the language of Genesis is the wa consecutive. It's known as the narrator's tense and functions in the sense of then X. Kenneth Gentry notes in his book, as it is written, that this high frequency of the occurrence of other wa consecutive verbs is completely consistent with the other narrative passages in the book of Genesis. In other words, the rest of the book of Genesis is clearly narrative, and it uses the same wa consecutive verbs in the first 11 chapters of Genesis, meaning the first 11 chapters of Genesis are just as historical as the rest of them. Wa consecutives are characteristic of the historical genre. Wa consecutives show up abundantly in Genesis 1. To be sure, there are poetical sections in the Pentateuch, but such as the Song of Moses in Exodus 15 or the Curse in Genesis 3. But none of this indicates these events are ahistorical. But Moses avoids typical poetic structuring devices in Genesis 1, which includes the creation account. Later biblical writers refer to the creation week or the creation narrative. They refer to Adam and Eve themselves or all of Genesis as historical. For example, Peter refers to the flood as history in 2 Peter 3:5, specifically saying that people deliberately overlook the historical fact of the flood. Both Matthew in 19:4 and Mark in 10:6 refer to the creation of Adam and Eve as historical. Paul says Adam was created as a living soul in 1 Corinthians 15:45. Paul says Adam was created before Eve in 1 Corinthians 11:8 and 2 Timothy 2:13. Paul says sin came into the world through one man, Romans 5:12. He refers to the temptation and sin of Eve in 2 Corinthians 11:3 and 1 Timothy 2:14. And the genealogy of Adam, Seth, and Enosh are referred to as historical in Luke 3:38 and Jude 14. The author of Hebrews refers to Cain and Abel as historical, and the genealogy in 1 Chronicles refers to Adam as historical as well. So it's pretty clear at this point that Genesis, in chapter 1 especially, is in the genre of history. The creation week does not have any poetic elements, which means it's prose. But even if it was poetic, that would not establish its ahistoricity. Now to the creation week itself. The Hebrew word for day is yom. Yom, and I'm just talking about the dictionary definition. You can look this up in a Hebrew dictionary if you want. Yom always means a normal 24-hour or sunrise to sundown day when it is used as a singular noun and is not found in a compound grammatical construction. Gentry refers to this in page 94 of his book as it is written. This is the exact form used in Genesis 1:1 through 2:3. Frequently, the prophets use the construction the day of the Lord, which does not refer to a 24-hour day. But this is because of the compound grammatical construction. This construction is the only exception to the rule, and this form is not found in Genesis 1. The creation days are explicitly qualified with evening and morning language. If there is any ambiguity about what yom meant, then this removes it. The words for evening and morning, Eber and Boker, occur 30 other times in the Old Testament, and they always denote a 24-hour day. Genesis also adds a numerical prefix to each day, indicating its sequential structure. This is further proof that the 6 days are literal because every time Yom appears in sequentially numbered, uninterrupted series, it always refers to normal 24-hour days. You can see this in Exodus 12:15 through 16, 24:16, Leviticus 23:39, and Numbers 7:12 through 36. In Exodus 20:11 and 31:15 through 17, those passages refer to the 6 days of creation and the 7th day of rest. These passages refer to the 6 days of creation in the plural as yamim. This expression, yamim, is used 858 times in the Old Testament, and it always refers to normal 24-hour days, never to ages of time, never to epochs. And lastly, if what Moses wanted to communicate was a long, lengthy period of time or ages or epochs, there is a specific Hebrew word, olam, that refers to the long length of time, and Moses does not use that word in Genesis 1. All of this evidence shows that when it comes to what the Bible says, it teaches six-day creation, and thus young earth creation. Whatever other evidence we find outside of Scripture, such as radioisotope dating, fossils, or whatnot, that must be interpreted within this context. We know that the Bible teaches six-day creation, so whatever else we do with the other evidence has to be interpreted in terms of that six-day creation context. We shouldn't be using general revelation to interpret Scripture, but Scripture to interpret general revelation.
All right, thank you, Seth. Thank you both for those opening statements. Now we're going to be transitioning to our cross-examination portion of this debate. Once again, it's a 60-minute cross-examination portion. Both parties get 3 10-minute opportunities to ask questions. Starting with Rob, you have 10 minutes to go ahead and cross-examine Seth.
Yeah, there's quite a few that I'd like to tackle. So in regards, let's start with respect to the word yom. So, for example, Gleason Archer, in his Bible difficulties, points out that you don't have the definite article before the word yom, and so he says the second major aspect of Genesis 1 is the revelation that God brought forth his creation in an orderly and systematic manner. There were 6 major stages in this work of formation, and these stages are represented by successive days of a week. In this connection, it is important to observe that none of the 6 creative days bears a definite article, and so the translations "the first day," "the second day" are in error. The Hebrew is literally day 1, like Yom Echad, and the same thing with day 2. It's a second day, not the second day. And so he says the Hebrew prose of this genre, the definite article was generally used where the noun was intended to be definite. Only in poetical style it could be omitted. The same is true with the rest of the 6 days. They all lack the definite article. Thus, they are well adapted to a sequential pattern rather than strictly delimited units of time. So this is the linguistic context of what Archer's getting at. But then you have scholars like Walton in his Lost World series pointing out the ancient Near Eastern scholarship is such that why do you have a pattern of 6 to 1, like kind of like what you see in Exodus 20 and also Leviticus 25, where you have the 6 to 1 pattern with respect to the crops and agriculture. So like work 6 years for the agriculture wise and rest 1 year. So in the ancient Near East, when you have a temple dedication taking place, that procession takes 6 days, and there's no there's no stopwatch. Like, okay, the temple inauguration, this is day 1. It has to start at 6 in the morning, and then it's going to end exactly at 6 p.m. or something like that. It's usually temple inaugurations take place. Some days it'll take 3 hours. Some might take 8 hours. Depends on what's going on with that inauguration. And then you have the deity, the god. When he walks into his temple, he then takes rest. He starts to sit down, and then he governs the temple. And notice that language is very similar to the Genesis creation narrative. You have Yahweh sort of, he's talking about what he's doing in creation. And all the descriptions that you see matches the tabernacle descriptions, like, say, the tree of life is the menorah, that sort of thing. And then the lights in the firmament, that's what you see also in the tabernacle scenario. And then when it says Yahweh rests, he's ceasing from work, and he's now in his temple. So yeah, so Yom in that sense, I don't see how it's a strict 24-hour period when you're lacking the definite article. and there's this ancient Near Eastern polemic going on because Israelites are, engaging the other ancient Near Eastern religions. And also, interestingly, John Sailhammer in his Genesis
Hey,
commentary
Rob,
points out.
let's make sure that we're asking questions.
Oh, okay.
Cross
So this is
examination. So I want to make sure that we're getting some questions in,
okay.
engage each
Okay.
other, right? All right, thanks, man.
So basically, Yom Echad, so no definite article, and very quickly in Exodus 20, there's no the word in, the preposition in is not there for in 6 days. So it just says for 6 days, meaning, and if day here is ambiguous, then it's periods of time. So yeah, go for it.
Well, basically, what it comes down to is when we're given two different possible interpretations of a passage, if interpreting the passage in one way causes a contradiction, then we obviously know that the other passage has to be the correct one. Given when it comes to the definite article, well, yes, for example, in English, it can be somewhat ambiguous to say the day or a day, but given all of the points that I made earlier, first, again, just the dictionary definition of yom is always, always, always 24-hour day. There's no exceptions unless it's, a prepositional construction, day of the Lord, and that construction does not show up in Genesis. If you want to say, well, there's no definite article there, so it could refer to a longer than 24-hour day. Well, there's also the evening and morning language, which always refers to normal 24-hour days. It's sequential, it's uninterrupted. So it's if you just had the word yom with no definite article just sitting somewhere and you didn't know what the context was, well, given that it's the word yom and there's no definite article, you could say, well, it's possible it could go one of two ways, except if you interpret it in any other way other than 24 hours, it contradicts all of the other proofs that I've given that it does refer to 24-hour day. And as far as the ancient Near Eastern context, basically what it comes down to is I'm interested in what Genesis 1 says, not what any other religion says.
So, but you see, yom, it's the word yom, like in Genesis 1 and 2, there's more than one meaning.
Where?
So, for example, in day 1, you have, and this is Yom Echad, but yet there's a night and day being mentioned once the sunlight, is able to reach the surface of the earth. And then later on in day 4, you have different types of days being mentioned. So, and in this case, you have long periods so like you have a day, a month, a year, then you have festival seasons, sort of hinted at.
Where does month and year show up anywhere in Genesis 1?
In verse 14 and 6 to 16. Seasons, days, years.
Okay, the concept shows up, but when it's talking about the sun, it says that the sun is supposed to govern seasons. It's not saying that day 1 is a season. It's just saying the thing that was brought into being on day 4.
No, what I'm saying is that day, the 4th day.
Mm-hmm.
So, according to the understandings of Yom, because Yom to an ancient Israelite, no ancient Israelite, like this is clear in ancient Near Eastern scholarship. No ancient Israelite would be thinking of Yom as being precisely 24 hours if you use Yom. Like,
right. I said that it can either refer to 24 hours or the day part of, the sunrise to sunset.
But Yom to an Israelite means a passage of time.
Can you show me any Hebrew dictionary that says that?
So Bayom in Genesis 2, verse 4, in the day that Yahweh created the heavens and the earth. So you have the whole week, so to speak, right, of that inauguration of the temple.
No, I'm saying you're saying that ancient Hebrews would not think of Yom as a 24-hour day. Okay, we're just talking about linguistics and
It's
Hebrew
not
language.
only a
Can you show
24-hour
can you
day.
show me any dictionary that asserts that?
I can point out Gleason Archer's, the Theological Word Book of the Dictionary. I can point out Walter Kaiser, who's a prominent Semiticist that brings it up. I can point out John Sale Hammer bringing that up. I can
Okay,
point out John
where does
Wilson bringing
Kaiser's
that up.
dictionary say that?
I'll have to get it. Let me just
Oh,
get
okay.
it. So in Genesis 2:4, let me bring it up. Even the early church fathers saw it this way. Let's see. Okay, so this is in my notes here. So the Hebrew word yom translated is used in biblical Hebrew to indicate any of 4 time periods: A, some portion of daylight; B, sunrise to sunset; C, sunset to sunset; D, a segment of time without any reference to solar days, from weeks to a year to several years to an age or an epoch. Yom cannot, however, be interpreted as indefinite, such as any time or someday, like oh, someday this will happen, or as
Mhm.
infinite time. So yom doesn't fall in that bracket. William Wilson,
Mhm.
in his Old Testament word studies, explains that yom is, quote, frequently put for time in general, or for a long time, a whole period under consideration. So yom is also put for a particular season or time with any extraordinary event happens. So this is in relation to day 4 and also Genesis 2:4, where you have yom used to describe this many different types of periods that at the end of the day are human constructions of their interpretation of time.
All right, that's
Because
time right there. That's time. All right, that is 10 minutes for Rob. All right, Seth, you have 10 minutes to cross-examine Robert.
If it's okay with you, he brought up specifically Genesis 2:4. Can I, since he was kind of in the middle of the question, can I just answer that one?
Yeah, sure. Go
go
ahead.
for it.
Okay. That, yes, I will give you Be Yam in Genesis 2:4, but that one is a prepositional construction, which means it can mean an age. But the other ones in Genesis 1 don't have a prepositional construction, which means they can't mean that. They're just normal 24-hour days. Um, let's see what questions I can ask you. Can you show me any example of the words evening and morning, Aber and Boker, meaning anything other than a 24-hour day?
I can point out that those words, so again, in Second Temple literature, early
Okay, can you
early
show
church
me a
fathers.
document from there that uses it that way?
I didn't tell you what it was. So basically, it can communicate something that is an emerging from a chaotic, like a chaotic state to an ordered state.
Hmm.
So you have this notion of it's chaotic, but God comes in, puts an order to it, a functional order to it, and then he designates it as very good, or like good. It's complete. Um,
What I'm asking is, can you show me, like, you're asserting that? Can you show me any example in Old Testament Hebrew where it's used that way? Where it's used
right
for
now,
anything
off the
other
top of my head,
than evening and morning?
right now, I can't do that at the moment.
Okay.
No, no. But
Okay.
it is discussed in the literature. Yeah.
Okay. Um, can you show me any example of Yom being used in a sequentially numbered, uninterrupted series and it referring to something other than 24-hour days?
Sure, I can speak about, let's see, Genesis 31, I think it is, with Laban and the sheep. Um, I can speak about Hosea 6.
Okay,
So,
Laban and the sheep. Let's take a look at that one. Genesis 31, you said?
I think so. Yep. Let me just bring it up. Let's see.
And I'm not just saying days used in the passage. Days
the word
used at
yom's
the beginning, and then days used in the middle, and then days used in the end. I'm talking about sequentially numbered and ordered and an uninterrupted series that uses the word yom.
Yep. Could be 33, actually. Let me just see. Because it says that they move the sheep 3 days. The flock. Or it could be... Wait, let's see here. Oh, it's Genesis 30, verse 36. So it says
And
he
he said
sent
it
them
is
as far
a 3 days journey between himself and Jacob. So was it? I mean, what are you trying to prove with that? That it was actually 3 ages or 3 epochs?
No, what I'm saying is there's an example of according to the context, you don't back then they were not moving those sheep 3 24-hour periods. Like exactly 3 24-hour periods.
No, that's the question I'm asking is how do you know it doesn't mean that?
Because because a 3-day journey in those times they would be doing at least 4 5-hour trips every day for those 3 days. So that day constitutes.
So are you saying that never happened?
No, I'm saying it didn't fit a 24-hour period.
No, I'm asking you to explain why. You keep asserting that. You're saying, well, it couldn't have been at 24-hour periods. Okay, why not?
Because of the practices of husbandry of the time that we look into, and like how they would tend the flock and move sheep and migration patterns, how long those would take. And so a 3-day journey is more talking about mileage than say, okay, let's start moving the sheep at 6 in the morning, this is day 1. Okay, day 1's going to end at 6 p.m. So now we stop the sheep. Day 2,
well,
we have to wait.
I'm not saying that they were moving the entire day, but they would move at their typical pace, maybe 4 or 5 hours, like you said, maybe 4 or 5 hours a day, and then they would spend 3 days doing that. I'm not saying I think it would be. I'm not saying that we should interpret it as they were moving the sheep for 12 hours straight every day.
But
it
do you
still
believe
took
the
them 3
creation
days
narrative?
to take that journey.
Yeah, but do you believe that the creation narrative, each day, God is taking precisely 24 hours to do certain things in each bracket?
That's what it says. I mean, that's what the word means.
Then therefore,
I mean,
you can
say, come on, does God really? I mean, that almost sounds like what Satan said. Come on, did God really say?
Yeah, but then you have to say the same thing about the sheep moving exactly 12-hour periods or 24 periods for each day. That's the same.
No,
it's going to make
that
the
the
same
journey
argument.
took 24. No, it's saying that the journey took 3 days, 3 24-hour periods. That doesn't mean that they were moving the entire time. It just
Exactly.
means that the journey took
So
3 days.
So how many hours in the day, like out of those 3 days, say the first day, how many hours do you think they were moving to complete
I
that?
I don't know how long in a particular day it took God to create something. I mean, he may have taken an hour to create something and then just kind of let it sit there for a day. I don't know. The scriptures, I don't think, really address it. But the period of time that it was spaced out was a day.
But
okay, I'll move on to a different question.
Okay.
Let's see. Can you give me any example of the plural yamim, which I mentioned is used 858 times in the Old Testament and always refers to 24-hour days, never to ages of time? Can you give me any example that in the Old Testament such that term refers to something else, some other like epoch or age or period of time?
I think that appears in Exodus 20 in the fourth commandment, where interestingly the preposition "in" is absent, which means that now you're talking about that plural of yom being ambiguous as to the length of time. So it literally 6 yoms. Like, okay, what is
Well,
that?
yeah,
And
six
then
days. That's what yom means.
right, but now we're coming down to this pattern of 6 to 1, and understanding that day is not strictly 24 hours. It can
No,
mean
that's what the debate is about. You keep saying it's not. It doesn't refer strictly to 24 hours. You just keep asserting that your position is correct. I'm asking you to argue for it.
yeah, I'm demonstrating to you that the usage of the word doesn't mean 24 hours, like that Laban's
Where?
flock, for example.
Okay, where in that passage?
That the flock were not moving for 24 hours.
Okay, that the 3 day.
That's how yom's
You're
being
you're
used.
switching to the previous question. I'm not saying that the passage says. I mean, I don't think anybody talks that way, where they say, well, it took me. If somebody says, oh, that building project took me a month. Nobody says that, meaning I was working 24 hours a day every second of that entire month to get that project done.
Yep.
It's referring to the length of time when they began to the length of time when it ended. So with the sheep, it's referring to 3 24-hour days. I mean, the other option is to say that it was 3 millions of years, which is what you want to interpret Yom in Genesis 1 to mean. That's obviously not correct. It's referring to the length of time. It's not saying that the sheep were moving every hour of every day for 3 days straight.
No. Like, for example, you have in the scriptures, like Abraham or Jacob, like went a stone throws away. Like this is figurative language in that ancient culture, where it's talking about, for example, now day yom is talking about distance, not time. So Genesis 2:4, you have Bayom speaking about, and at the end of the day, the
Yeah, that one I already gave
basic
you. That
word
one has
is
a
Yom,
Genesis
right?
2:4 has a prepositional construction, so that one can mean age, but that prepositional construction doesn't show up in Genesis 1 anywhere.
It's describing the days of Genesis 1.
Right.
And so, for example,
The evening and
Hebrews
morning, 24-hour periods.
Hebrew 11:3. So Hebrews 11 verse 3.
Okay.
A lot of
It's written in
translations will
Greek.
point out, sure, but the author, because don't forget, you have the Septuagint, and then you have the author of Hebrews, which I believe is Paul, using the word ages and epochs. Some say aeons. Some scholars will say it's like an aeon, speaking about the periods of time that was taking place in Genesis 1. That's how they understood Yom in that sense as well.
All
So
right,
it comes
that's
back
time.
to the linguistic issues that Archer was bringing up.
All right, that's time right there. All right, Rob, you have 10 more minutes to cross-examine Seth.
I will simply ask Seth to explain to me, like, so these are the linguistic issues, but then what about the creation narrative apart from day? Like, why do you is there a contradiction between Genesis and, say, modern science and evolution?
No, I don't think there
How the
is.
architecture
When
is
it comes to how I interpret some of the scientific evidence, basically, what it comes down to is every fact is an interpreted fact. So there's no. So, for example, when it comes to the radio, I mean, I'm familiar with calculus. I took differential equations in college, so I'm familiar with the decay equation. And the thing that I think people make the mistake of is the decay equation. There are two variables. There's the initial mass and the amount of time. If you get millions of years, you're making an assumption about the original mass, which is something that absolutely nobody actually has knowledge of. Nobody was there to measure the original amount of uranium or something to see how much it's decayed. So equations like that are true, but you have to keep in mind there's something. It refers to something beyond just the mathematics. It refers to the real world. You have to ask, do we actually know what the variables are involved? And it becomes an exercise in begging the question. If you say, well, how do you know it was millions of years? Well, the equation says it was. Well, how do you know the initial mass was that certain amount? Well, because that's because it's been there for billions of years. But how do you know it was billions of years? Well, the original mass was this much. You're reasoning in a circle if you do that. And when it comes to the alpha, beta, and gamma decay, first of all, they all give different answers. They're all in the millions, but there's also isotope evidence, such as the helium diffusion through zircon crystals, I think it is. I'd have to get the actual graphs out, but the actual evidence there, I mean, it's radioactive isotope stuff, and it actually does
So you're
point
talking
to a
about
little
Gentry's
6,000 year. I'm sorry?
You're talking about Robert Gentry's work with the zircon helium diffusion.
I don't remember the scientist involved. You might be right, but the equations there do point to a literal 6,000-year-old Earth. So regardless of which ultimate perspective you choose, you're going to have to do something with the apparently contradictory evidence. There's apparently contradictory evidence to 6-day creationism, which is the radioisotope dating of alpha, beta, and gamma decay. But if you're a Christian and you want to take the millions of years approach, well, there's apparently contradictory evidence that you have to deal with or explain away in some way. And there's the zircon crystal evidence. There's the evidence of Scripture itself, which, if you take it at its literal meaning, at its actual face value, and you don't make Yom mean something that it doesn't mean, it points to a 6,000-year-old Earth.
Yeah, but notice the leaps you're making with that. So, because it comes down to, it comes down to, first and foremost, obviously understanding the Genesis 1 narrative, which is in itself isolated from, we're talking textual criticism here and like the whole documentary hypothesis, that stuff. I don't really hold to that. I'm more of a complementarian. So, I can see a redactional process taking place. But then you're talking about, say, Genesis 5 and the ages given in that, which form a base. It's due to a base 60 Sumerian kingless type taking place there, and then that then extrapolates into the 6,000 something year range, which then you're trying to now fudge using
I didn't use
second order
any arguments having to do with Sumerian or Babylonian cosmology or number systems at all. I don't know
what I'm
using those arguments.
Sorry?
I don't know why you're bringing that up. I didn't use those arguments. They sure don't.
No. What I'm saying, I'm sort of clarifying that this is the background context that scholars are quite aware of as to why the passages are written the way they are.
Okay.
And so there's a certain irony of neglecting that. So all I'm saying is you're taking at face value the English translation of, say, Genesis 5 genealogy.
I'm looking at Hebrew dictionary definitions. I'm not looking at the English translation. I have an English Bible that I've been referencing.
Yeah, there's lexical dictionaries that give the meanings of words, and then there's the context of the words in light of the ancient Near East and how they're used. So let me first.
Okay. In the ancient Near East, people use words. I'm interested in how the words are being used in the Old Testament, not how other languages.
And you have Old Testament writers. Yeah, I know, but you have Old Testament writers using the same words to make an argument as a polemical argument to their neighbors. Like Psalm 104 is a creation hymn by David responding to the creation Aten hymn of the Egyptian creation Aten hymn. Okay. So let me just put this way. So you went Genesis, like the youngest creationist goes Genesis 1, Genesis 5. Then you have the genealogies elsewhere, like in Genesis 10, and then you construct this like timeline, and then
yes, that's what a genealogy is for.
Rates. Yeah, but it's very ambiguous. Like Chronicles doesn't give any ages.
No, it's not. The numbers in all the genealogies are very exact. I actually read a book called The Wonders of Bible Chronology by his name escapes me. He was a writer in the late 1800s. He shows you how you can get it. There are some parts that are a little, well, actually, no, it's not really obscure at all. He shows you how you can get more or less the exact year the Earth was created if you follow all of the chronologies and the years for people having children, people dying. Uh, it's very exact. There's nothing ambiguous about it.
Except for the fact that you have a number pattern taking place in Genesis 5. Like you have the common values of 0, 2, 5, 7, and 9 that fall under a base 60 sexagesimal math system that the ancient Sumerians were very familiar with. And
Okay, hold on. Which passage in Genesis 5 are you even referring to?
all the numbers in Genesis 5, they have a common value of 0, 2, 5. So, for example, Enoch is 365, and that follows a solar
You're talking about
calendar.
the ages that people have. Okay.
Yes.
Why
And
is
then
that
when
a
you
problem?
and studies, well, it shows that it's following very clearly a base 60 number system, which means those numbers are not literal. That's the first clue.
Why can't they?
The
I
second
mean,
clue is when you
God
add.
is sovereign. God can control things, and he very often makes very interesting coincidences in
Yeah,
history.
well, it seems a bit too neat and clean. For example, Lamech is 777.
So,
Methuselah 969 is a triangular number that goes down to 153. Interestingly, John
okay.
uses that
Well,
number.
let's tag off of that for a second. There's a passage in I'd have to look it up. I might be able to find it, but it's in Ezekiel, or no, it's in one of the Gospels where it says that there were exactly 153 numbers that Peter and the apostles caught in their fishnet, which happens to be a triangular number and references two words that are used in Ezekiel. I think it is. I could look it up you can look it up if you want to. But yeah, God is sovereign over everything, including all the numbers that have ever been thought of and have ever happened. I mean, there are a lot of interesting coincidences in Scripture. I think that's just more proof that God is sovereign. It's not like he's just trying to be neat and clean and so
But
you
then
can't.
why doesn't that pattern continue on into the Deuteronomistic history of the kings? Like you have very natural years given in the kings of Judah and the
God
kings
is
of
sovereign and
Israel.
decided not to plan things that way.
But the Genesis narrative, like Genesis 1 to 11, is what scholars call proto-history, which falls from the Babel story back. So you're talking about
Mm-hmm.
a culture in that period of time, 4,000 plus years ago,
Mm-hmm.
that thought in radically different ways, which means you can't then say, for example, one of the Sumerian, Utnapishtim, is the Noah figure of the Sumerian king list.
Okay.
Now, Noah this is where it gets interesting because Noah, like, is that actually his name? Because
Yes.
when you see the word Noah used in the passage, there's a definition given that his name means comfort. Whereas the larger
That's
ancient
very
Near Eastern
common.
cultures would
Names
say,
mean things. That doesn't mean that these aren't real historical people. I mean,
yeah,
the
no, no,
Apostle Peter said explicitly
I'm not
that the
denying,
flood, there were eight
I'm not
people.
denying.
He wasn't saying there were like eight kinds of people or eight groups of people.
No,
It
no,
was
no.
eight people.
I'm not saying that Noah didn't exist. All I'm saying is you have um, names given that, in light of the older ancient Near Eastern material, can actually be anachronistic, but that's okay. So this is part of the redaction process I'm talking about in the Genesis narrative. So
Okay.
coming back to that radiometric decay rate thing. So the ages given, if you add it up from Adam to Moses,
All
you
right,
get
that's
12.
time right there, Rob. That's time right there. All right, Seth, it
I'd
is.
be happy to answer his question.
Oh,
Let him finish up.
all right, go ahead, Rob.
I'll just be very brief.
Okay.
You have
Okay.
12,600 years from Adam to Moses. Notice that 12,600 figure, if you divide by 10, you get 1260, which is you see in Revelation and Daniel. You're going from that and jumping straight into radiometric decay rates with second order differential equations and saying that,
Yes.
oh, I'm going to try and fudge now the math equation to try and fit this. And the only way you can fudge it is to make it variable. So like the decay rates change over time. So they were faster in the past compared to now, and that's physically impossible.
Okay, a couple things there. First of all, when it comes to Genesis 1 through 11, this is a point I made in my opening statement that the same kind of prose that you find later in Genesis is also used in Genesis 1 through 11. So if everything after Genesis 11 is supposed to be prose and literal history, The same kind of language is used in Genesis 1 through 11, so it's also prose in its history. When it comes to what I actually do with the radioactive decay rates, no, I don't think that fundamental laws change. When it comes to how you interpret evidence, um, you might be at a point where you just say, I'm not sure what's going on. I don't know how to answer that. But that's the problem that I think you're running into is you have to fudge the numbers when it comes to the meaning of yom. Yom only ever means 24-hour day. That's it. Unless there's a prepositional construction. That is the
And then what
only
about
exception.
a day is like
Hold
1,000
on,
years?
I'm answering your question. The prepositional construction is the only exception. And so you just have to kind of assert and just kind of decide that, well, yom doesn't mean that sometimes. You just have to contradict the evidence that you have. So when it comes to an actual explanation for the lengthy periods of time, one thing that I would go back to is we don't know the initial masses of any of these samples. So the billions of years estimate is always suspect because it's always based on a certain initial mass assumption, which is a fact we don't have. Then there's also some amount of I remember reading about something called crustal mixing, which can change the alpha, beta, and gamma, the numbers that they get. So what it comes down to is I'm not just fudging the numbers. I'm doing my best to honestly interpret the evidence, given my presuppositions. You have to do the same thing. You have to reinterpret the evidence in terms of your presuppositions. The problem is mine is actually faithful to Scripture, and yours isn't. There you go. I tried to be as
All
brief
right.
as I could.
That was a good answer. Good answer. No problem. No problem. All right. So now, Seth, it is your turn for 10 minutes cross examination.
um, Let me think. If I don't think I actually need to do any more cross. I think we're good.
I would like to tackle that radiometric thing more, to be honest.
Sure, if you're okay with it, Marlon.
Yeah, go for it. You guys got it.
Cool.
So, uh, rubidium strontium isochron dating. Are you familiar with that?
Okay. Um, in the sense that I know it's radioisotope dating, I haven't studied that in detail.
So there's no assumptions of parent-daughter relationships and ratios in that. Yeah, that is the beauty of rubidium strontium. That is like, I guess you could say, the way the other dating methods, like lead to lead, or uranium to lead, or potassium dating, like any type of dating, that rubidium strontium is a way of seeing that the fine structure constant is constant, very constant,
Okay.
and therefore the so-called assumptions, which philosophically speaking are there, about the amount of parent to daughter, that is actually then put aside. And for example, the fact that we even have lead existing means that it's taken at minimum 4.5 billion years for uranium
How do
to
you know it's
decay down.
4.5 billion years? Do you know what the initial mass of that sample was?
Mass sample size has nothing to do with the time.
That
So
it's in the equation.
you said,
M of t equals m sub 0 e to the negative, what is it? Lambda over t, I think is
yeah,
the
what is
equation. Lambda
m
is
sub
the
zero?
m sub 0 is the initial mass sample. I'm asking you, how do you know what the initial mass sample is? You
So
don't.
when you're doing parent-daughter relationships, so you're talking
Yeah.
about natural logs, right? Now,
Hmm.
if you're gonna combine natural logs together, what happens to the lambda and the t in the exponential power with respect to m?
Well, what do you mean combine them?
So you have parent-daughter relationships, and in the equation, the m sub zeros on either side cancel out, and therefore, if you're wanting to find t, so what you do is you reverse the exponential, make it into a natural log, and then you're able to find t apart from the mass, and therefore the lambda is the the rate of change. So from uranium-238
Maybe you
down
could
to
explain it. I'm not sure everybody knows what you mean. What do you mean by parent-daughter relationship?
so you're talking about the initial. So like uranium, right, is parent to lead, which is the daughter.
So uranium
So
decays into lead.
right, and it takes the half-life is 4.5 billion years roughly. So
Okay.
let's say we take 1 kg of uranium, and
Okay.
right, can you hear me?
Yeah, I
Just
can hear.
just okay. So one half-life later, that's going to come down to 500 grams. So
Right.
in the second order differential equation with respect to uh, decay rates, actually this is you can't put this into a first order differential equation. Um, so are you familiar with ordinary differential equations like ODEs and
Yeah, I
stuff
took
like that?
diffie Q in college.
Okay, so the MO then will fit under the category of a percentage, not an actual mass. So you can designate MO as just one, or like 100%, which then becomes 50%, which then becomes 25%. And
Yeah, but that
so
still doesn't tell you that you know what the initial mass was. I mean, you could say it's 100% of the initial mass, or it's 50% of the initial mass, but you still don't know what the initial amount was. And that it's an arbitrary assumption that you have to assume for
no no no
the
no no no
equation.
no, no, it has nothing to do with how much there is and how much there's left. This would be talking there's no necessity to know that it's exactly 1 kilogram or exactly say 10 kilograms of uranium that becomes say 5 kilograms. We're talking about pure abstract mathematics here, that from a percentage context you have the
Hmm.
rate of change, the time required for it to go from 100% to 50% is 4.5 billion years of, for uranium
Right,
to lead.
right. What I
So
understand what you're saying. I'm not saying that in order to test. I'm not saying that in order to figure out what the half life is, that you actually have to have the sample for an entire half life in order to verify it. I know that's not true. The way we've looked at half lives is, you watch uranium decay for a minute or a day or a month or a year or something. You see how much it decays, and you can figure out what the decay constant is. But that just tells you what the decay rate is. It tells you that it would take 4.5 billion years for half the sample to decay. It doesn't tell you that
exactly.
that has ever actually happened. It's
No,
kind of like, let's say,
mathematic.
look,
No, no, no.
let
Okay,
me explain.
okay.
If I was driving from Seattle to Moscow, that takes about 5 hours. And if I was halfway there, somebody asked me, "Oh, so 10 hours ago you were in the Pacific Ocean then?" Like, no, that doesn't make sense. I mean, you're from Australia, maybe you're not familiar. So Seattle is near uh, it's near Puget Sound. It's near the Pacific Ocean, and you drive east to Moscow, Idaho. Now, if you had been driving that same rate in that same direction 10 hours ago, you would have been in the Pacific Ocean. But the fact that you're going at that rate doesn't tell you that you were ever in the Pacific Ocean. It just says that if you had been going at that rate for 10 hours instead of 5, you would be in the Pacific Ocean. That's the same thing with the thing that you're talking about. It doesn't, we can never find out that the billion of years actually happened. We can only tell you, it only tells us the rate at which the decay happens. It may
Are
happen to
you
be
are
billions
you
of years.
are you saying because it's 4.5 billion years, naturally we don't have that longevity to witness 4.5 billion years to see it go from uranium to lead?
No, I'm not saying that because no one has personally witnessed it. I'm saying that no one has access to that information about how long it's been. We know that the rate is
But
4.5
we
billion
do.
years. No, no, we don't. We know that its rate is 4.5 billion years. That's all we know. We don't know if
But
a billion
but
years or 4.5
the
billion.
chain
Hold on, hold
the
on.
chain from okay.
We know that the rate is 4.5 billion years. We don't know that that amount of time has actually come to pass, has actually come by. The only way we could know that kind of thing, I think, is through special revelation. we'd have to know the person
No,
who
no,
knows
no. I'm
everything. We
sorry.
would know how old
This
the
this
earth
is
is.
not. I'm in the field. This is not. This is not. No scientist would agree with you on this. I'm sorry to say. Like,
Let's see. I know Dr. Gordon Wilson would agree with me on this. No, Dr. Stokes would. Dr. Mitch Stokes. I know
what
plenty of
published
PhDs who
literature in
would
the
agree with
field
me on
would they
this.
say? Because for example, Gentry, when you're talking about zircon crystals, like Gentry points out in his paper that you need a minimum of 500 million years for that zircon thing to happen. Therefore, his presupposition of Genesis being a young Earth creation, he then hypothesizes a change in the fine structure constant to bring about the few seconds or whatever,
Well,
how many
if
seconds
somebody
he
wants to
can.
be a young Earth creationist and adjust, if they want to deal with the evidence in ways different than me, that's fine. I might look at the way they deal with the billions of years evidence and say, I don't think you're handling it correctly. I don't think what you're doing is logical. I don't think it
But
makes sense.
just
That doesn't mean that my presupposition is incorrect.
so, in the decay chain of uranium to lead, what other decay chains are there in between uranium and lead?
I'd have to study it. I haven't looked at that stuff, and
Because it's
I've
not
looked at
just
specific
uranium to
decay for a
lead.
while.
There's a whole chain. Some take a few seconds, some take a few minutes. And what nuclear physicists are able to do is actually take. So, okay, to use your analogy of the car, like you're traveling from one location to another, so from A to B.
Mm-hmm.
If you only had markers of exactly A and exactly B, and it takes 4 billion years, yes, you're right. We don't have the means to witness the entire event taking place, except maybe in astrophysics circles where we look at supernova events and we notice the ratio of uranium to lead in the nebula clouds and all that stuff. But what we can do is, okay, so based on chemistry alone, we know that the chain follows these amount of isotopes to finally lead to lead, which is a stable isotope. So
Mm-hmm.
we can isolate the chain and see, okay, this will decay into this, and it only takes a few minutes. And sure enough, that works. Then this will decay into this for a few seconds, and sure enough, that works. So to use the car analogy, you have A to B, but then what if there are markers like A sub 1, A sub 2, A sub 3 that leads to B sub 1, B sub 2, B sub 3? So you can have individual sort of check in a race. What are they called? Checkpoints.
Yeah.
Like, okay, that the driver has now checked at this point, and he's still progressing forward. We see that. We actually see that take place, and then when you
Yeah, I
extrapolate that
understand
out,
that there are samples. Like if you have a decay chain and there are like 6 samples in it, we have samples from all 6. Okay, so
right?
God
So,
created samples of all 6 simultaneously.
but notice that's an assertion that you're
It
making
doesn't
now,
prove that
which
all of them
no,
started at that first sample.
you can't have a simultaneous existence of lead with uranium. Lead is a result of uranium decay. You can't just have lead just appear ex nihilo. You need that
That's
evolution,
exactly what
so to
the
speak.
audio ex nihilo is. That's exactly what Genesis asserts. It's like, well, you can't create ex nihilo. Um, yes, that's true. You're
But
not
Genesis,
God. So
but Genesis 1 doesn't actually communicate um, creation ex nihilo.
that might be a good topic for another debate then.
Yeah, because there's no definite article
If
on
this
it
was
in the
my
general
cross
laws.
exam, I think I'm done, Marlon. Did you want us to keep chasing that rabbit trail, or?
Yeah, I mean, I was gonna let you guys go, but if you guys are satisfied, the 10 minute did expire. I was going to continue to let you guys go because you
Oh,
decided
okay.
that you didn't want that 10 minutes. So,
Yeah.
but if you guys are done with the with your questions, if you have any more questions, then we can
Well,
progress to. Go ahead,
I
Rob.
just I just want to point out, because I am feeling somewhat uh, disappointed in the because I'm hearing what you're saying,
Yeah.
but I feel like you're not hearing what I'm saying. And what I'm getting at is, like, in our discussion a couple of days ago, I told you
Yeah.
about, for example, plutonium-239.
Mhm.
And because I have the discussion open, and I said, look, it takes 15 half-lives for plutonium-239, 361,000 years basically, for it to completely
Mhm.
decay out. That sample doesn't exist anywhere in Earth's crust, but we know it takes 360,000 years for it to decay out completely. The fact that it doesn't exist in Earth's crust means that Earth must be at least 360,000 years old. Then you have other isotopes well into the millions range that don't exist in Earth's crust. Naturally, because it's taken that long for it to decay out. But we do see them appear in nebula clouds and in supernovas and all that stuff out there. But the fact that the Earth even exists as a material form the way it does means that those decays were happening to bring about volcanism, tectonic uplift, the composition of the atmosphere. So
Well, no,
this stuff is
I mean, I understand what you're saying about the decay chain. You can have 6 elements in a decay chain, and you say, well, the existence of all 6 means that, it went from one to the next, to the next, to the next, and we know the half-lives of all of them. No, I mean, like I said, creatio ex nihilo. God created samples of all 6 in all sorts of places and in places that we wouldn't expect. None of that proves that there was billions of years going on. All it proves is that God created elements that were just strangely interconnected in that way in terms of their physical operations.
Okay, then why? Okay, I'll give you a very interesting, fascinating perspective on this. So Tycho Brahe, during the time of Kepler in the
Mm-hmm.
1600s, because they didn't have the theory of radioactive decay rates, they would notice supernovas in the night sky as obviously these bright stars, these objects that would shine, and there would be a period of so many months it would take for a supernova to go at its maximum brightness and then disappear. So
Mm-hmm.
Tycho Brahe's journal points out a particular supernova that now we can actually see the aftermath of that. But he in his journal he talks about, okay, this month it's this brightness, and this month it's this brightness. The brightness, now that we have nuclear physics at play, the brightness corresponds to the development of new materials, heavier elements, which in itself has a certain half-life taking place, and that half-life corresponds to the size of the brightness as well taking place of the outer perimeter of that explosion. So when we correlate Tycho Brahe's journal with the brightness he was seeing in relation to the simulated models that we have in computer analysis, and also current actual radio astronomy measurements of certain things, it all works out. So what I'm saying is, when a supernova happens, notice there's a sequence of events taking place for things that didn't exist to then evolve, and so now new isotopes are formed, new elements are formed, like carbon, oxygen, ultimately iron has a higher activation energy required for iron to form. It's so you need an evolution even in the present reality of things for it to exist the way it does. Like what you're saying is, when a supernova happens, those elements are like already there, but they're not existing until they somehow just pop into existence at that exact moment when the explosion happens. Or I don't know. It's really weird. This concept
I think
that we
it's
have.
perfectly possible that God, when God created the universe, He created some stars that, were about to supernova or were already in process, or created a situation where phenomenologically it would look like one had just gone supernova, or no one would go supernova in 1,000 years. When it comes to that particular, I haven't studied that particular topic much, but God created all sorts of things in such a way that with the appearance of age. For example, Adam and Eve. I mean, they were a couple of days old, and they looked like probably they were in their 30s, I would guess. Trees had rings, rocks had, their rockiness.
But then
So I don't think that's something that mitigates against the thesis.
it goes right against those verses in Jeremiah that speak about the fixed nature of the laws of heaven and
No, it's not
earth.
going
That God
against the
said,
laws of nature. It's just saying God can create something in process if he wants to.
yeah, like where did Solomon in Ecclesiastes make that conclusion? Because he had a very
I mean,
uniformitarian.
the Bible isn't a science textbook. I'm not saying that the Bible talks about supernovas and processes, that are currently ongoing. I mean, there's a lot of
But
stuff that
doesn't
the Bible doesn't say explicitly, but we can we have to draw conclusions from what it says. Um, I mean, if we reason in such a way where we contradict what it says, then we know that our
well,
reasoning is
why
wrong.
can't you just say, look, I see day one, the initial conditions of the earth. So this is now the concordist application. It says that it's
Mm-hmm.
dark on the surface, the whole surface is covered with water, and the spirit is hovering. And
Okay.
in Origin of Life research, I can say, yeah, early Earth, 4.5 billion years ago, was the world, and
Okay. Well,
life
that's not
is.
what day one means.
Sorry?
I mean, it comes down to what does the text say? Let me, maybe I can use this analogy. If you were pulled over by a cop for going through a stop sign, and he said, "Well, I'm pulling you over because you went through a stop sign," and you said, "Well, oh no, officer. I mean, I thought what that stop sign meant was stop using the brake." Well, that's obviously not what it says. So there's a big you have to distinguish between what does it say versus uh, what you believe. I mean, a stop sign means stop. That's what it means. Yom means day. That's what it means. If you can decide you don't like it. You can decide that you're going to ignore it. You can try to fudge it. You can try to fudge the word stop to make it mean what you want it to mean. But at the end of the day, that's what you're doing. Yom means day. That's it.
I'm with that example of day one. I think your analogy of the cop is a really cool analogy. So I'm not speaking about the word yom there specifically. That's a linguistic thing that we were talking about a moment ago. What I'm saying
Yeah.
is the whole context of day one. You have succession of things taking place. It's not happening all at once. You have a succession of things that you have the original condition being that you have a water world, then you have the spirit hovering, that then leads to this thing known as day and night. And so now, to use your cop analogy, let's go to the ancient Israelites. The ancient Israelites will be talking about Marduk and Tiamat. So Tehom is the deep, that the spirit, that Yahweh is the one taming. Tehom is Tiamat, basically, because it's a polemic to say that your gods, in your creation narrative, Marduk and Tiamat warring, and hence Earth is formed the way it is. No, Yahweh
Mhm.
is the one that's subjugating chaos. This thing known as Tiamat in your creation story.
Yeah, I don't think it's
Fast
I don't
forward.
think that interpretation is wrong to say. Like I've heard that before. That the way Moses writes the Genesis 1 narrative, that it is designed to be a polemic against ancient Near Eastern cosmologies. I haven't read up on that very much, so I'm not sure if I'm convinced by it or not. But that's I mean,
Yeah,
then it's a
but what
false
I'm getting at
dichotomy. I
is,
mean, you're just saying, well, because it's talking about Tiamat, it can't be literal days. No, why can't it be both?
the moment you have polemical language, you're completely removing yourself from any form of concordism, whether it's younger creationism, old Earth, whatever, and you're
Why?
only
Why can't
focused
why can't it be a literal day and a polemic?
because that's not what the ancient Israelites. No Second Temple Jew believed in a 24 period for that, for that day. Um,
Well, if they believe their
you
Hebrew
have you
dictionaries,
haven't
they
you have to
did.
demonstrate that you have to demonstrate that the you have the Old Testament biblical authors. You have also
Yes,
New Testament authors. You have Second Temple
yes,
Jewish literature like the Qumran sectarian
yes.
community.
And we're talking about
None of them
Moses,
speak about,
not some Second Temple Jews.
and even Moses as well. None of them speak about. It took 24 hours for that process
Except that's what
that you
Moses
see from
says, and he
water world.
reiterates it in Exodus 20. He says Yamin. It's 6 days, six literal 24-hour
But the,
days,
but then
and
the
we're
linguists
just
like
talking
Lisa will
dictionary
point out.
definitions at this point.
But then the linguist will point out that the preposition in, like in the King James translation, in is in italics, because when it's in italics, it's not in the Hebrew. So now you're talking about this period of time that it's 6, stages, let's just say. And you
No,
have that
6
same
days.
6 to 1 pattern.
It's yamim. It's plural.
Okay, let me just.
Okay,
see,
let me reiterate this.
where my
858 times yamim shows up in the Old Testament. It always means days, 24-hour days. That's what it always means. You want to tell me that there's one exception in Genesis or in Exodus 20?
You see,
No.
what's going through my mind is that I'm thinking of anthropological research and
Right,
how
but the
humans
debate is about
came up
linguistics.
with this. It's all interconnected. You have like the science of linguistics of why humans thought the way they did, why they wrote the way they did, in light of the natural world that they were experiencing. So we know
Yes.
that 100 million years ago it was actually 23 hours. 100 million years from now it'll be 25 hours. I mean,
Okay,
young Earth
you're
creationist literature,
presupposing what you're trying to be debating, but
we can do that estimation by the fact that the sun is not the sun, the moon is receding at a certain rate
yes,
with
if
respect
you
to the
assume that
dynamics
it's
of the
already
solar
millions
system.
of years old, which is what you're supposed to be arguing for, not assuming as a premise in your argument.
No, there's no assumptions of millions of years. This
You
is simple
just
Newtonian
said
mechanics.
if it's a million years, there's your assumption.
No, I said we know that 100 million years ago it was 23 hours, and 100 million years from now it's going to be 25 hours because of the
Yes, if it's
Newtonian
actually true
mechanics
that the Earth is
between.
millions of years old, which is what you're supposed to
But
what you're supposed to be
I'm not
arguing,
even.
not
I'm not
assuming to
even.
make a point.
I'm not even. No. I'm not even assuming anything. I'm saying if you take Newtonian mechanics alone, g m1 m2 over r squared, and you correlate that with the motions of the moon with respect to the Earth, and even Kepler's laws of motion fit into this. You can then do a calculation for t, and notice that yes, based on the dynamics of the way the moon's receding, it'll slow the Earth's rotation down to 25 hours 100 million years from now. And so before it
Okay,
was
I'm sure that's
23.
true. I mean, I don't know if the universe is going to last 100 million years. I mean, yes, if it lasts 100 million years from now, then that's what will happen according to those mathematical calculations.
Okay.
That doesn't mean it's going to happen.
But notice you have different scientific
If your
disciplines
position
that
is true,
correlate.
then certain things follow. But we're debating about whether your position is true in the first place.
So I'm in Australia. You have the Great Barrier Reef on the east side. I'm on the west side. So we can actually see coral distribution for the last 300 to 400 million years, and actually follow
Or God
the
created it
designation.
that way.
Let me finish my point. You have
Okay,
the
that's fair.
moon. If the moon was closer, right, then you have a higher tidal frictional force taking place, right?
Yes.
And the Earth is rotating at a faster rate, an hour faster, so 23 hours, 100 million years ago.
Mm-hmm.
So about 21 hours, so 300, 400 million years ago was the day. So that means we can actually see the way the coral distribution in the Great Barrier Reef grows at a certain rate, and the changes taking place at the geological level as well as at the paleontological level. And we can actually go, oh yeah, because it's the tides and the moon, and because it was closer. And so you have the discipline of astrophysics in relation to marine biology and paleontology and archaeopaleontology, like marine biology, that everything fits. There's no assumptions being made. There's explanations as to why it exists the way it does, as we see it right now.
That's what a
Hawaii
worldview is you look at facts and you interpret them in terms of your worldview. Of course, it's going to fit into your worldview. It's your worldview that you're using to interpret the facts. The facts fit into my worldview as well. my young Earth creationist worldview. The
You're
problem
just
is when it
asserting.
comes to
You're
your
just asserting.
worldview, you're just ignoring what Genesis 1 says. You have to fudge the numbers to make Yom mean something that it doesn't mean.
Seth, notice that what you're saying is that God, well, okay, yes, there's these changes in the coral reef, or even like let's take Hawaii, like the 4 or 5 islands of Hawaii, like you have the big island, and then you have smaller islands. Each one takes hundreds of millions of years to emerge because of the volcanism in the Pacific Ocean.
Right.
And each island has different fauna, mostly flora, different flora. And even the landscape is different and unique because of the huge time gaps between each island. So you're saying, no, I don't care about the fact that there's differences. It's just ex nihilo God, bang, he created Hawaii Islands just like that. He created the
I think that's
reef.
one option. But I also think that there are examples of geological occurrences happening that happen almost instantaneously. For example, people will claim that the Grand Canyon took millions of years to create. Well, there's actually disconfirming evidence of that. When I think it was when Mount St. Helens exploded, it created. I'd have to double check. I'm reaching back in my memory.
Mount St. Helens and
Mount St. Helens
Grand
created.
Canyon are not related.
Okay, well, hey, let me finish my point.
Okay.
I think it was. It might have been a different explosion, but I think it was Mount St. Helens that created some kind of river valley because of its pyroclastic explosion instantly. I mean, it didn't take millions of years. It wasn't this trickling river that just eroded for millions of years. It was just an explosion. So geologic events like that can happen in a very short amount of time.
So the explosion is different to a water carving event. That in flood geology, what you're saying is you need the pressure difference of the amount of water required and the weight of water would be equivalent to the type of explosion that you see in a volcano, which is, in that sense, like, my goodness, you're talking about.
No. I'm not a specialist in the area. I'm not saying that I have an explanation.
Because I'm already
Hawaii...
doing the calculations in my mind, and it's.
I'm not saying that I have a specific
size
explanation for how Hawaii formed, other than God made it. Maybe God made it the way it is. Maybe He made it, halfway to where it is now, and it's created 2 or 3 more islands or something. I don't know. I'm just saying geologic events. You can't just say that geologic events have to take a very long time. Some of them don't. Something like the Grand Canyon could have happened in a very short amount of time, because something like a river valley can be created by a volcano explosion. It doesn't have to be one way or the other. It's just you're interpreting it that way because of the worldview you've adopted. It's 2 different perspectives that we're talking about. A deep time perspective and a young Earth perspective. You're going to interpret the evidence in terms of your perspective. I'm going to interpret it in terms of mine. The question is, what does the text of the Bible say? And you keep running away from what the actual meaning of the word Yom is. It means day. That's it.
Jumping from what we perceive in science to the interpretation of Yom, there's no connection.
I thought you said knowledge was interrelated. You were the one just making that point a minute ago.
No, this literally, your reasoning there is like ad hoc. You can't jump from this ancient linguistic
I was talking about the nature of
understanding
worldviews.
But it is ad hoc. It's a non sequitur. There's no correlation between our understandings of, say, the Hawaiian Islands, how they form, or the Great Barrier Reef, or even supernova events, or whatever, like anything to do with the study of reality, in relation to this ancient usage and understanding of the word Yom. So when I look at Yom,
no, they have something to do with each other. They're both created by the same God.
I look at the descriptions of each day, and I see sequential patterns taking place. I see a sequential ordering of events. For example, day 5.
Which is more proof that my viewpoint is correct, because when that kind of stuff happens in other texts, it's always a 24-hour day.
But it's not ex nihilo. That's the point. It's not instant. There's a
Like I
progression.
said, the ex nihilo thing, we'll have to debate that another day. I mean,
Like why?
six
Okay,
day
day
creation, I
five.
think,
Why?
is.
Why did the early church fathers question the relationship between birds and fish based on their reading of day 5? Because it says out of the
I don't know what
oceans.
church fathers. That's not something I've read. I have read Augustine, who was the guy who coined the term creatio ex nihilo. So I know he believed in creatio ex nihilo.
Well, he's talking about in the New Testament, like Hebrews 11:3. Sometimes that word
Is
aeon
that
can
like
actually
Genesis
mean
1?
time. No, Augustine was actually a New Testament. He wasn't a Hebrew linguist. He didn't know much of Hebrew. He was more from the Latin, and obviously also the New Testament usage there. So, and plus you have the Greek sciences that was thinking in a very discrete manner, rather than the poeticness of the Hebrew language. Um, so,
Well,
but Saint
yeah,
Basil and
we'd have to
Hippolytus.
debate that another day.
Yeah, well,
Yeah, well,
Hippolytus.
we got about a couple more minutes before we transition.
Okay,
Gotcha.
I'll ask you this question and go for it. If maybe you can try and attempt this question. So Hippolytus in the
Okay.
2nd century said humans come from fish. Basil said that birds and fish are of one family. There you have your monophyletic pedigree language in the 3rd century. Then you have John Calvin and Martin Luther in the Genesis commentaries, literally, and John Calvin says there are atheists in my day making a mockery of this because birds and fish don't have any relationship as far as we know. But I'll just trust God's wisdom with this, that somehow the birds and fish derive from each other. Then Philip Schaff in the 1800s, translating the Church Fathers, there's a footnote where he goes, "Oh yeah, now because of Darwin, and we understand that you have fish, dinosaurs, and then birds, and basically birds and dinosaurs are a type of reptile that goes back to marine life. There you have your cladistic taking place. So that's 2,000 years worth of understanding, um, say day 5, which in evolution, the Cambrian explosion, there's a long time leading up to basically land life and terrestrial life, and then obviously avian life, bird life. So was that ex nihilo, or was that obviously a
No, I
long
don't think
time
day 5.
of evolution?
I mean, there was already. It seems like you kind of changed the question. I mean, yes, I believe in creatio ex nihilo. Um, I don't think it happened on day 5. I mean, God created things.
Was day 5 in verse 1 of Genesis 1?
Was day 5 in verse 1 of Genesis 1?
Yes.
No.
The events of day 5.
No, I don't think so. I mean,
So then it's not creation ex
verse
nihilo.
1 says, "In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth." That's not day
Yes.
5.
Yeah, so therefore it's not creation ex nihilo. You have a progression that leads to day 5, and day 5 in itself, according to 2,000 years worth of Genesis interpretation, speaks about this relationship of marine life and avian life.
Okay, as far as the church fathers go, I've learned a lot from church fathers. They also say some things that are also kind of silly. It's also possible for somebody to read them and give them a wrong interpretation that they insist is correct. I'd have to take a look at Calvin's commentaries and Hippolytus and what they actually say. Maybe they're saying something silly. Maybe it's a bad translation. I don't know. I haven't
What's
studied
your
that particular
what's your
topic.
understanding of heavens and earth in verse 1?
I'm sorry.
What's your understanding of heavens and earth in verse 1?
I believe heavens and earth is an idiom for basically everything everything that we see, everything in human experience, and so it's not literally just heaven and earth. It's everything that exists that isn't God.
Yep. Okay, I agree. So it's a merism phrase. So Bereshit, that is not, there's no definite article there. So it's not in the beginning. It's literally beginning. And then Elohim and then Baraz. So it's like saying when God began to, and then you have heaven and earth. create heaven and
I've
earth.
heard that interpretation. I don't know enough about specifically about Hebrew to. I've heard that is incorrect. That's not my understanding. Um, I wouldn't be
That's
able to
not
give you a refutation.
correct. That's literally the latest peer review on that. What I'm getting at is you have this idea that God has in his mind in the text that I'm going to create totality, which involves everything that, like, kind of like what you just said, the merism phrase. So let me then describe to you the process by which everything emerges. And hence, verse 2 onwards is that progression. So you
Yes,
don't
and he
have
says
creation.
he takes a day each time, a 24-hour period.
And so there's the crux of the debate then. It comes down to
That is what the debate's about.
So, but that doesn't. You haven't demonstrated any young earth science to correlate with that interpretation of day. That's my point. So
I have. I mean, we had a cross-examination about my answers to. I mean, there's zircon crystals. I gave an answer to why
but again, have you read
alpha, beta,
Gentry's
gamma
work?
decay doesn't work. At least the way you interpret
Again,
it. These are questions I've answered.
No, you haven't. You've asserted zircon crystals.
You don't like the answers. You don't accept the answers. But I've answered the questions.
The thing is, I've read the papers to do with zircon crystal testing and dating. So the oldest zircon crystal actually happens to be in Perth, Australia. 4.45 billion years is the dating. And I asked you, did you read Gentry's work? And you said no, because he's the only
no.
guy.
I read it somewhere else. I read the zircon crystal stuff somewhere else. I don't think I read Gentry's specific paper.
You're talking about helium decay rates, right? In
yes,
zircon crystals.
Helium atoms and zircon crystals.
Did you read the
Gentry's actual paper?
Because Gentry is the only guy that brings up this argument, and even in his paper argues for the fact that you need 500 million.
I haven't read the paper. I read it somewhere else.
So then you haven't demonstrated an argument. That's my point.
No,
if you've read
no.
you can engage me on the science.
Answered your questions. You didn't like the answers. I offered answers besides I'm just right.
I'm engaging with the argumentation of the paper by which you're saying I received it from a secondary source, not the primary source, which is Gentry himself.
Yeah.
So,
well, I'm not here to argue over that.
I'm engaging with the data.
When it comes to science, when it comes to radioactive decay, when it comes to the helium zircon crystals, when it comes to fossil evidence, I have given and I can give answers. You don't like the answers, but you can't say that I didn't answer the question.
You didn't answer the question because you didn't engage with the science at all.
Yes,
I was engaged with you with rubidium strontium, right? Showing that
you don't like the answers, but I gave them.
Okay. I think the audience will see otherwise, so it's all good.
All right, fellas, good stuff. Good discussion. Appreciate you both. All right, so now we're going to go ahead and transition to our closing statements. Robert, if you want to go ahead and give a 10-minute closing.
So thank you for this discussion. I'm not really one for debate sort of like a process, debate points, like a speech, and then, for example, the 10-minute cross-examination. This is something I need to get used to. I'm more familiar with just discussion and engaging with the scholarship. So, but the one thing I can take away from this discussion is that the pursuit of truth, like, for example, when Pilate says, what is truth to Jesus? And speaking about the church fathers and how they come from that Latin heritage. So, like, you have what's known as an anagrammatic, rewording of that phrase, what is truth? And literally it can mean it's the man that's here. And so there's a famous painting of Pilate sort of like with his hand motioning to Jesus, what is truth? And then it's just another way of saying, well, it's this guy right in front of you. He's the truth, like the way, the truth, the life, that sort of thing. And so early Christianity in the first century, this known as this logos principle, the word becomes flesh, Christianity is actually a scriptural religion. It's a religion of the book. It's like Romans 12, like the renewing of the mind. And in verse 2 of Romans 12, it speaks about logical worship. Literally, the word, you have worship and the word logos connected over there. So you could translate that as, like, say, scientific worship. And this is the reason why we have basically the emergence of the scientific method. Where Christianity, when finally it became, instead of this minority group, it became a Mediterranean, religion. The whole Roman Empire started to encompass it, and that removes superstition from the Greco-Roman religions, and it then brought about this rational, logical way of reasoning about reality. So Romans 1:20, like we can understand God's invisible attributes through creation by means of investigating nature and so on. So if we are people of the book, my takeaway from this debate is that I'm not wanting to accuse Seth of anything. I've seen the argumentation, and Seth is producing content that I feel he hasn't basically hasn't isolated himself to uniquely research this material and make up argumentations based on a type of a developed skill set. Now, he claims to have done ODEs and differential equations, so I'm immediately going, oh, great. I'm immediately thinking of the maths and the equations involved with that, because that's a skill set that you learn over time and part of education and so on. And I'm allowing that to be what it is, because that's what truth's also meant to be. And so then to go from that and then jump into these wild interpretations of decay rates and to assert that there's assumptions going on, when really I pointed out that you have rubidium strontium isochron dating that removes those assumptions, and the math is still the same in that sense. So anyway, all the science discussions that we've had, like Gentry's halo claim, it would be refreshing if Seth went, yes, on this page in Gentry's work, this is the argumentation, and then we dialogue on that point. And unfortunately, that didn't happen. Same thing with the linguistic issues of Yom and like Gleason Archer's argumentation and the quotes I gave. Then you have the ancient Near Eastern context with respect to the creation narrative and the temple inauguration and why Genesis is written the way it is. Then you have the genealogies and its relationship to the Sumerian king list. Notice that all of these things are in themselves their own topic, and then ultimately have no relationship to evolution and how life evolves and the process of life. And so therefore I think I don't think we actually were able to tackle my opening, where I connected the cross and resurrection and theosis with the logos and his relationship to the universe, because in evolution, the human body that the logos incarnated into, that human body is the universe. It's stardust, and it evolved from prior species as well. And so for Jesus to reconcile the whole heavens and earth, like kind of what we were getting at with the merism phrase, the only way that's possible is if evolution is true, because of that hypostatic union between the logos and the universe. So ultimately, we didn't get to that. We were talking mostly about the creation. But one positive note is that I do appreciate Seth's cordial manner in this. It was a lot more comfortable than most young creationists I engage with. But I feel Seth is not engaging with the literature, especially when in the science component there, that that would have been quite refreshing if he was able to engage that at the scientific level, but he didn't. So I think that's all I can say now, and I'm looking forward to the Q&A.
All right. Thank you, Robert. Appreciate you once again for coming on the Gospel Truth. All right, Seth, you got it. Go ahead and give a closing statement.
Well, I do want to thank Rob for showing up to this. I am glad to engage with other believers. One of my favorite verses from the Bible is "Iron sharpens iron." I try to be well reasoned, and I always try to indulge more into my discussion. So I appreciate that my occasional snarkiness wasn't off-putting to him. So that is appreciated. But basically, I would just reiterate what I said about how we are. Just to answer one thing that he mentioned. I have no doubt that Rob is a converted Christian. We just interpret the Bible differently. So I don't doubt the salvation of somebody who believes in theistic evolution. I do believe it's incorrect and unbiblical. And what I do believe is that, again, we're coming from two different worldviews. One is deep time, one is young earth creationism. And over again, I think the debate demonstrated that we interpret evidences in terms of those perspectives or conceptual schemes or perspectives or worldviews. Over and over again, when I gave a bit of evidence, he would reinterpret it. When he gave me evidence, I would reinterpret it in terms of my convictions. I do believe, though, at the end of the day, he didn't answer a number of things that I said. He did bring up some objections to my interpretation of Yom. I don't think any of them worked. He said, well, for example, Genesis 2:4, he said, well, it means an age there. Well, yes, of course. It's a prepositional construction. That interpretation makes sense. That's one that I allowed for in my interpretation. But it just comes down to, what does the word actually mean? We can't, the Bible says Jesus wept. You can't honestly interpret that other than Jesus wept, Jesus cried. If you look at the doctrine of the Trinity, there is no honest way to interpret the Old or the New Testament, I don't think, unless you come away with a Trinitarian understanding. You have to fudge the numbers, as it were, in order to come away with a non-Trinitarian understanding. You have to fudge the numbers if you want to come away with any understanding of Genesis 1 other than 6-day creation. Yom means 24-hour days. It emphasizes evening and morning. It emphasizes the sequential ordering. It is prose, just like the rest of Genesis is. When it comes to the radiocarbon dating stuff, I pointed out over and over, and he seemed to have admitted this at one point, that we don't know what the original amount is. And I still remember my differential equations. M sub O, which means initial mass, is still in there. There is no way for anybody to know for certain what that is unless they were there a million years ago. But that's the point that we're supposed to be debating, is whether that's actually true, that they were there a million years ago. He talked about, what else did he talk about? We talked about ancient Near Eastern interpretations of cosmology. Again, we're not talking about other religions. We're talking about what the religion of the Old Testament says. There are all sorts of things that, he said that his bizarre statement about that the only way that the resurrection can happen is that if evolution is true. Not, that somehow the Bible doesn't have anything to do with evolution. Well, the Bible is written by God. It's infallible. If God says he created the universe in 6 days, then he did. And if you try to, I'd refer back to, I think it's Colossians 2, where it says that if you, Jesus is, Jesus Christ, you have to have, all knowledge is deposited in Christ Jesus. You can't make sense of reality unless you believe in him and accept him at his word. If you try to interpret reality in a different way than God created it and God made it the way it is, you'll become vain in your reasonings, as Romans 1 says. And I think there's good evidence to show that that's what is happening with Rob's reasonings. I do appreciate him coming on. We obviously strongly disagree, but I appreciate the opportunity to have a chat. So.
All right. Thank you both for those closing remarks. Appreciate you once again for coming on and joining me in this episode of the Gospel Truth. And we are now going to the Q&A portion of this debate of this episode. So I have a question. Rob, do you believe in a literal Adam?
Yes, I do, but he wasn't the first human. So, I mean, can I expand on these questions? Is that
Yeah,
possible?
absolutely. Sure.
Yeah, yep. So I think Genesis 1 is a very generic overview. So you have the ancient Near Eastern context, and then you obviously concordist-wise, from an evolutionary context, you have the emergence of the hominids. That, in the text, interestingly enough, speaks about very, I guess you could say, very negative ways of, of these humans are to operate reality. So subjugation of the earth, rulership over the, you know, the creation. And so this fits what's known as chaos kampf, the struggle against chaos. And so then Adam and Eve emerge out of this population in Genesis 2, where God then starts to become more localized. And then you have what's known as like the cosmic mountain stuff taking place in Genesis 2. So Eden's in the Persian Gulf with the four rivers and so on. And Eve, interestingly enough, the whole rib thing, which is a mistranslation, it just means Eve comes from Adam's side. And again, in an ancient Near Eastern context, take a human shape, and if you cut Adam or this human shape, this anthropomorphic thing in half, it's this beautiful picture of one side becoming male, one side becoming female, and hence if you rejoin them, they become one flesh. And so another a closing on that interpretation is the sleep that Adam has. So tardima or ecstasis, those are the Hebrew Greek words, which literally where we get the word ecstasy from. And you see this throughout the Bible. You have Abraham having a tardima. You have Peter in Acts 10 having an ecstasis. So these are visionary argumentations to say, Adam, this woman is from your side. She is what makes, from an ontological sense, what makes humans work as one flesh. So, yeah.
Okay, so okay, you said that you believe in the literal Adam, historical Adam, but you say he
Mm-hmm.
wasn't the first human.
No.
So, at what point did sin enter the world? Was it
Mm-hmm.
prior to Adam, or was it did Adam bring sin into the world? Or how would you deal with that? How would you deal with that situation?
Yeah, and that comes interestingly enough to the whole Romans 5:12 situation and how Second Temple Jews were understanding this thing known as original sin. So there was no concept of original sin until later on in the early church. Now, now I don't reject the fact that you have this thing known as sin.
Mm-hmm.
So I think what your question should be asking is this notion of the fall and how that then affects humans, the relationship between humans and God. And Genesis 3 is actually the start of two other falls that take place later on, which then becomes the basis for what's known as Second Temple demonology. So you have Genesis 6, which is the sons of God thing taking place, and then you have the Babel account, which is the Genesis 11. All of that combined then relates to Genesis 12 as now like a brand new sort of like a restarting of like a new humanity product, which is now this thing known as Abraham and Israel. So then, in that sense, sin is not this like mechanical, like step-by-step process that is traced back to a single man, and therefore all his actions is like God is like computing like every particular point, going, okay, now's the time when sin enters in, and therefore moving forward, I'm going to try and work with that. No, sin. So humans before Adam, and during Adam, and after Adam, were fallible creatures. Therefore, the death that you see Genesis 3 is discussing is to do with the fact that the relationship between God and humans, spiritual death and idolatry that was emerging. That's what muth, the Hebrew word for death, that's what it's talking about in that passage.
So sin did not come into the world with Adam then. So I guess
Because you don't have that. You don't have that mentioned.
because I guess my confusion is that sin if sin did not come into the world with Adam. So let me ask you: do you believe that Adam was created perfect, without blemish?
No humans were created. Nothing was created perfect.
How, that's the hard thing for me to reconcile, because I believe the Bible is pretty clear that his creation was good. It was
Sure.
it was and when God proclaims something good, it's not this.
And
That's
and
that,
again,
and that,
good.
that's a very confusing aspect, and
Right.
I think it's it's extremely important and vital when the way we
I'm
interpret
trying.
those
Yeah.
type of words, because I mean, I guess you know where I'm going with this, Rob. So
Oh, yeah. I'm trying my best.
hmm
Trust me, because I'm trying my best to be very succinct.
hmm
So you have this thing known as chaos kampf. Now, philosophically, like Leibniz's argument, like in the 1700s, to do with the best of all possible worlds.
hmm
This goes back to early church discussions and even Jewish discussions before the church, where if God is going to create a perfect creation, well, that word perfect, because don't forget, Jews take very seriously the relationship God has with his creation, meaning there's no dichotomy between heaven and earth. It's like heaven and earth are actually one thing. It's just that God is positioned up here and humans are down here. So when they talk about things like perfection, well, only the tree of life is perfect. And then again, you're wondering, like, well, what is the tree of life in that sense? Meaning, only God ontologically is perfect, and why? Because he has the omni attributes. If he's to create something perfect, that means it has to by default be an omni this ontological thing that has omni attributes. Naturally, the creation doesn't have omni attributes. Therefore, it falls under the category of a functional, like it's good in a functional way to bring about, and this is now the gospel, to bring about a creation, a new heavens, new earth, that has no more sea. Like you see in Revelation 21:1, it says, I saw a new heavens, new earth, and there's no more sea. But what does sea mean in that ancient understanding? Sea means chaos, imperfection. Because it starts with the chaos, Genesis 1 verse 2. And then Revelation 21 is all about, well, now there's this new reality where now the creation is now with God, literally, ontologically is with God. Like John 17, when Jesus saying, they are one with us, one with, I'm one in you and you're in me, and they will be one with us.
hmm
Well, how is that possible? Well, the incarnation, the relationship of the hypostatic union where theosis is possible, and that transformation of something that's created and limited then has its relationship and connection with the Trinity ultimately. And so now God's able to ontologically have a quote unquote perfect sort of creation because he's joined it to himself. But in the original process when he's creating it, he can't create another Yahweh. It's less than him, which means chaos, death, suffering, entropy. All that is a natural result. And Romans 8 says this. I'll end it with this. Romans 8, Paul says, the creation was subject to futility, but not by anything it did. Notice that the young creationists will say, Adam brought sin and death into the world. Sure enough, yeah, death came amongst humans because of the rebellion. But ontologically, death came into the world? No. Paul clearly says there's a corrupting bondage, and not by anything it did, rather it was God's wisdom that resulted in this thing known as theosis and glorification. through the incarnation, to then redeem creation through that.
What are your thoughts, Seth? I think you're muted, Seth.
Oh, yes. What I said was yikes. Yeah, no, I don't think that the Bible teaches that God and creation are basically one, and one is just like a higher layer. I think it clearly teaches that God is in and of himself, creation ex nihilo. There's a creator-creature distinction. I don't think, I mean, again, going back to the six-day creation, no, I don't think, I think death and sin came through Adam. Romans 5, I think, makes that clear. And of course, creation is not subjected to corruption by anything it did. It was subjected to corruption by Adam's actions. So I think there are a lot of difficult implications from what Rob said, and I think it just comes down to it's not what the text of the Bible said. You have to interpret, Scripture interprets Scripture. You can't just take Romans 8 and try to make it say that, Romans 5 is false. So.
All right, let's get to some of these questions because they are out there. Let's get to some of them. All right, you'll see a pop-up at the bottom of the screen there.
Okay.
Oh, that was not supposed to happen. So let me fix it real quick. Hold on. That was not supposed to happen. I had the wrong overlay up. Let me get the right overlay up and go back in. All right.
Come on, technology. We believe in you.
I'm telling you, right? I'm telling you, we believe in you. All right. It should be coming up now. On the bottom of the screen, it says, question for Rob. What is your view on an analogical days that proposes the days are 24 hours used as metaphors for God's long ages of creation?
Yeah, this falls right into the temple inauguration, the layout of the Genesis 1 creation account. John Sale Hammer, interestingly enough, speaks about that the word arets, the land or earth. The whole Genesis 1 and 2 is actually speaking about the Garden of Eden. And that basically it's another way of saying, so Genesis 1:1 starts with heavens and earth, which means totality of everything. And therefore, the land wasn't fit to, it wasn't ready to bring about this emergence of Adam and Eve, and ultimately God's relationship with the humans. So you have this process taking place of the development of the land, and then finally Eden is formed. Like that's I have 1 foot in that, and also 1 foot into the larger ancient Near Eastern context, and I guess you could say a 3rd foot, or maybe a hand in the science arena of applying all the details of this to make this magnificent sort of understanding of how it all fits together. And,
Seth, any thoughts?
Well, basically what it comes down to is what I mentioned in my opening statement about genre. If you're going to interpret something literally, you have to know that it's a document that's supposed to be interpreted literally. If it's supposed to be interpreted poetically, you have to know that it's a document that's supposed to be interpreted poetically. So, for example, in Isaiah and Ezekiel, it will frequently talk about the destruction of, Edom or Egypt, and it will say things like the moon turned to blood and the star or the sun lost its light and stars fell from the sky. That's obviously not literal because that clearly didn't happen. If the sun fell from the sky, the earth would be burnt to a crisp and we wouldn't exist. So it's obviously a metaphorical statement in that particular passage. In the particular passage of Genesis 1, just adducing all of the evidence that I had, it is not poetry, it is prose. It is a historical, literal narrative. So, no, I don't. If somebody wants to say that they are analogical days, they're just saying that they don't want to interpret it the way it ought to be interpreted. It's supposed to be historical, literal, and prosaic.
Okay. Next question for you, Seth. How do you get a literal 24-hour days or sundown, sun up in the creation account when the sun was not created until day 4?
Because God can still measure time without a sun. It's obviously, to some degree, it's phenomenological. I mean, even if there did not exist a sun, if it just kind of went out, or if we went into the middle of space, you could still say that time existed, because you could still have the amount of time for 24 hours to pass by. Um, you could still measure that kind of thing. I mean, you could measure it with a stopwatch, even if there's no sun. So God was speaking their language to interpret, or to explain something that was true. But God is omniscient. He can tell time even without a sun.
Okay. Rob, any thoughts?
Well, scholars again will point out that the sun existed in day one. If you're talking about the merism phrase, I mean that's point one. Like the merism phrase is talking about the existence of the sun, moon, and stars already there. Joel chapter 3, 14, 15 or something, it has that same merism phrase, and he actually in the Hebrew connects it with the sun, moon, and stars. Sailhammer, Archer, Wolke, Kaiser, Walton, they'll all point out that the Hebrew construction in verse 14 and 16 about God making the great lights and the lesser lights, that's in the past tense, that he had made these things and now they have an eventual function now to be literally visible in the sky, which means now from a concordance point of view, and we know this in Earth's early history, that the Earth originally had a 100+ thicker atmosphere than the way we have today. Then the moon formation event pretty much modified that a bit. And then the emergence of oxygen, so from early biotic life leading into a type of photosynthesis, say 2 billion years, you need a long time frame for then oxygen levels to jump. And the moment you have a certain percentage, like 8% of oxygen, the atmosphere will be very hazy. The haziness will start to clear up. And then day 4 is all about the period in Earth's history where there's enough oxygen for clarity, where you can actually see the sun, moon, and stars. And interestingly, day 5, when you start to see the emergence of more advanced phyla, like for example birds, in that passage, well, they need the visibility of the astronomical objects to do their migration patterns. So it's interesting that it happens on day 4, and then that's set up for day 5 and the animals of day 5 to behave the way they do because of what's set up in day 4. And obviously this takes, long time, like 4.5 billion years of Earth's history for all this to happen. So I just want to ask, can I ask Seth a question in regards
Sure.
to the absence of the sun?
Absolutely.
Because
Yep.
Hugh Ross makes a brilliant argument here that if there was no sun, what was Earth doing? Like as far as the gravitational tidal forces, its rotation, like in day 1, it speaks about day and night rotation. Well, if there's no sun in day 1, why would there be this differentiation between day and night?
Basically, what it comes down to is I don't think the Bible isn't a science text. I mean, God, uh, just because I can't explain how something happened doesn't mean it didn't happen the way the Bible says it. So in one sense, I don't really need an explanation, because it says what it says. As far as rotation, well, God was keeping it in rotation.
Because I've heard young Earth creationists say his Shekinah glory was the light of day 1. And Hugh Ross's argument is, and it is a legitimate question.
I don't know. God was keeping some kind of light in creation, some kind of point source, and it wasn't the sun. Or he was just keeping track of time without a point source.
But Hugh Ross's argument is that point source, whatever it is, if it's a Shekinah glory or some light, well, it literally has the same characteristics and physical characteristics as our sun. So therefore, why replace it with our sun when it already functions like our sun anyway?
Again, the text says what it says. Yom means day. just because I can't give an explanation of how something doesn't mean that it did. I mean, you could say, well, why would God create frogs? Well, I don't know. He did. Well, why would God create, you know, light and day before he created the sun? I don't know, but that's what the text says he did.
Okay, it just seems illogical because I don't agree with that perspective of what the text is saying. So it's all I'm saying is that model of interpretation just makes no. It's very silly. I mean, I'm not saying
That's not that point source one is not a hill I would die on. I was just giving an example of a possible way to reconcile it.
So how do we deal with how do we? I mean, what is this is an interesting point. How do you two deal with verse 3, chapter 1 of Genesis? Then God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. And God saw that the light was good, and God separated the light from the darkness. Okay, so how do you deal with that? I mean, if God said, "Let there be light," what's going on there, right? What's going on there, and is that light sufficient enough? Well, obviously the biblical text said it is. It's sufficient enough to establish whatever he has, whatever else God wants to do, right? So
I'll read.
how do we deal with that verse?
Yeah, I'll read. So what I'll do is I'll spend a minute presenting how I see it, and Seth can go, "Yep, but this is my perspective," and then you judge which is more logical. So John Sale Hammer basically gave what's known as an interpretive translation of Genesis 1. How would an ancient Israelite pass the grammatical construction of that passage? Basically, how would they paraphrase the verse if they were having a dialogue with someone in the ancient Near East? This is how he translates verse 2. God's world, however, I'll read verses 1 and 2. So verse 1 says, "Long ago God created the world. He created the sun, the moon, and the stars, as well as all the creatures which inhabit the earth. He created all of them out of nothing, not in a single instant of time, but over a vast period of time." So that's Salehammer's interpretive translation of verse 1. Then verse 2 says, "God's world, however, was not complete. He had not yet created human beings, and the land where he intended to put them was not yet suitable for them. It was covered by a deep ocean, and the sun could not penetrate the dense fog which covered the waters. God's Spirit, however, was already present over the waters covering the land." And now here's verse 3. "One day God set out to prepare the land for human beings. First, while the darkness of night still hung over the vast surface of the waters, God spoke, calling on the sun to rise and break through the dense fog. At his command, the daylight broke through the darkness." So that's purely the construction of the Hebrew, if you wanted to extrapolate the meaning. Science says that, yes, there was this dense fog. It was a very thick atmosphere. The spirit that's hovering, interestingly, the word for hover means to incubate, to bring about life. And it's the same word you see when the angel tells Mary that the Spirit will overshadow you, and hence the body of Jesus is generated in that. So that means in the early oceans you have life emerging, a type of cyanobacteria that transforms the atmosphere. And that transformation, basically, they take in the carbon dioxides and so on, and they release the oxygen, and then the transforming from an opaqueness goes to a translucency. But notice, translucency means you can have light coming through, and hence day and night, like a cloudy day, but you're still not seeing the visibility of the astronomical objects. That occurs on day 4.
So you're saying it's just basically weather conditions preventing the sun from coming
Because
through?
the sun's already there. Science says it was a water world. Sure enough, Genesis 1:2 says it's a water world. Now here's where astrobiology, so the atheist will say, but God are the gaps with respect to origin of life. And sure enough, I believe in that aspect, that yes, God is the reason why life emerges in the oceans, because they still can't explain origin of life. And so the more we look into it, the more paradoxical it becomes. So God does create life in the oceans. You need intelligent design for that. But then that life, through a process of time, starts to transform the earth the way it does. And sure enough, that's what the text is saying.
Seth?
I don't have much to say other than God was able to create and sustain light without the sun, and he just decided to do that. I mean, he creates everything else and sustains it. I mean, he created every planet and sustains it in existence without anyone else's help. So if he wants to create and keep light in existence without a sun, he certainly has the power to do that.
Okay, and this is the last question right here. Let me send this over. This is for you, Seth.
Okay.
Says, question for Seth. How do you square Hebrews 11:3, the chapter that hits the highlights of Genesis, that by faith we understand the ages, quote unquote ages, were prepared by the word of God with young earth creation?
Hebrews 11:3.
Yes, Hebrews 11:3. That's where we see ex nihilo, where we get a hint of that anyway.
By faith we understand that the universe was created by the word of God, so that when...
Yeah, that's a translation. Some say universe, some say worlds, but worlds plural. Some say aeons, some say ages. My favorite translation, the ISV, says time. So, yeah.
If I knew what the original Greek was, I might be able to give an interpretation. But my translation has, by faith we understand that the universe was created by the word of God. So, yeah, the universe was created by the word of God. That's what I understand it to mean.
But the question's getting at
my suspicion is that some people
he has
age,
age, quote unquote. So I think he's essentially believing that there possibly could be a gap of time there. That's why he's emphasizing ages there.
Give me one quick second. Hold that thought.
Okay.
Okay. Yeah, the Greek is aeonos. Yeah, apparently universe can be an acceptable translation of the word aeonos. It doesn't have to be translated ages. So.
All right.
What translation were you using?
I just looked up Greek interlinear. The one I have is ESV.
Right. Yeah. So the ISV has time, which is a very rare, but I just love that because that goes right in line with space-time continuum with Big Bang and I could go to, like, say, Lawrence Krauss and say, look, the wheel, the DeWitt-Wheeler construction of space-time, the emergence of time as a physical property at the Big Bang. Krauss will say, oh, we can go into multiverse hypotheses and say that the universe is eternal that way. And yet, the more we look into it, no, time does have a definite physical beginning. And only Hebrews and the early church, and even Augustine using that verse, they were the only voices saying, no, the universe, like time, is finite. And sure enough, that's true.
All right. Any further thoughts, fellas? Anything else you want to throw out there for the audience? I know we did closing statements, but if you want to give a little closing word out there, go for it.
I got nothing. Other than read your Bibles and believe it.
That's right. All right, fellas. Go ahead, Rob.
Yeah, I think I'll just say that the takeaway message, John 3:16, even though it's a cliche verse in the English-speaking world, but the more you think about that in light of theosis and what God had to do, and like the monogenes theos, the unique God, or in this case, the unique Son, Jesus, like for him to, like, basically, what's the most efficient means for God to reveal himself? The incarnation, Jesus, the gospel. That to me is the most important thing anyone needs to know. And all of these other issues, like creation, evolution, this is like secondary adventures into, well, let's see what was happening back in those days. Yeah.
All right. Thank you, fellas, once again for joining me.
Yeah.
Seth, this is your third debate, man. number three for Seth, man. So
no, I think it's number 4, isn't it?
Is it number 4?
Yeah, because I debated an atheist, and then I debated Cody, and then
Oh yeah,
you had me
that's
sub
right.
in for somebody else. So this is
Yep,
number
this
four.
this is number four, man. See, Seth is a face that people are getting used to seeing on the gospel truth, man. So good stuff, good stuff. Thanks, Rob. As always, Rob, I send gifts out. So for first time participants in debates on my show, I do send a gift out, and so I'll be contacting you to see how I'm gonna get a gift to you. I know you're way over in Australia, so maybe we can figure out some way to get that gift to you, man. But I do want to send a gift to you, and we'll figure that out after the show is over. But thank you both once again for joining me on this episode of Gospel Truth, man. And I'll be getting contacting you, talking to y'all soon.
Thank you.
All right, thanks, Marlon.
All right, all right. Well, folks, another one of the books. This was a good one. This is a fun one, right? Because we got into some science, we got into the Bible, we meshed it all together and see what we came with, man. So this kind of stuff is always fun when two Christian brothers can get together and disagree. I mean, greatly on the subject matter and still have a cordial, wonderful, loving, wholesome, and fruitful conversation. So, and that's what I want for you. Rob pointed out like the most important thing we may disagree on, certain aspects of soteriology. We may disagree on certain aspects of how the Bible interprets creation. All these different aspects that we are able to disagree on. But one thing we cannot disagree and we cannot let divide is our understanding of the incarnation of Christ and what he did on the cross and resurrection, what he did for salvation. We cannot disagree on that. That is a pertinent pillar of the faith. That is a foundation upon which we stand on, and we cannot divide on such subject matter. That is vitally important. And once again, I'm so grateful that Rob and Seth were able to come to an agreement on that, but obviously deal with some of these issues that we do disagree on. They did it in a correct manner that represents Christ in the right way. But with that said, I do want to go ahead and go over some of the announcements that I have coming up for Gospel Truth. Let me bring this up real quick. All right, coming up on April 6th, I have a debate. James D. Martin, we're debating Warren McGrew, and they'll be debating is total depravity biblical. That's coming up April 6th at 6 p.m. Pacific Standard Time, so be on the lookout for that one. After that, I have Sam Shimon coming on. He'll be debating or discussing with Kwaku L., who's a Mormon. Sam Shimon's a Christian, if you don't know, and they'll be discussing Joseph Smith. Was he a prophet? Is he a prophet? It'll be a great discussion, I suspect. So make sure you mark your calendars for that one. That's coming up April 9th, 2020 at 6 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. And I have Jordan Gramrat, an atheist, Shane Helton, a Christian, and everybody having a debate. Is God's existence coherent and congruent with reality? That's coming up April 14th, 2020 at 6 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. And finally, I have Daniel Allgood and Cole Perkins. They're going to be discussing sensationism. And does the Bible teach sensationism? That's coming up April 17th, 2020 at 6 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. But with that said, I'm going to go ahead and get out of here. I want to thank you once again for joining me on this episode of Gospel Truth. I appreciate you. God bless you. And may God keep you. Gone.